Good afternoon. It's so wonderful to see you all here today, and welcome. My name is Richard Locke. I'm a professor of political science and international and public affairs, and currently serve as provost of Brown. And it's wonderful to see you all, and I am delighted to be with you this afternoon for the 92nd Stephen A. Ogden Memorial Lecture on International Affairs. The Ogden Lecture is one of Brown University's oldest and most distinguished lectures. Since the first Ogden Lecture in 1965, the university has welcomed heads of state, senior diplomats, elected officials, prime ministers, veteran journalists, and other policymakers and practitioners who have spoken from their personal experience about some of the most pressing matters affecting global peace and security. The Ogden Lectures were established as a memorial to Stephen A. Ogden, a member of the class of 1960, who died in 1963 from injuries sustained in an automobile accident during his junior year. And as a student, Stephen dreamed of promoting international peace through a career in international relations, a dream that is still shared by many Brown students who enter our international relations concentration, one of the most popular, largest concentrations here on campus. Peggy Ogden, Stephen's sister and a member of the Brown class of 1953, was unable to join us this evening. We are delighted, however, that her good friends, Dr. Robert Ackerman and Brown trustee Susan Adler Kaplan, have joined us to represent the Ogden family, and I would invite them to please stand and be acknowledged by us today. Thank you both. Today, it's my great pleasure to introduce our most distinguished speaker, Dr. Ernest Moniz, the United States Secretary of Energy. We have particular affection for Secretary Moniz here at Brown because of his high impact work as a scientist, as a scholar, and as a policymaker, and he's also a local boy. He grew up in nearby Fall River, before going to Boston College and then to Stanford, where he earned his doctorate in theoretical physics from Stanford University. Prior to his appointment as the nation's energy secretary, he served as the Cecil and Ida Green Professor of Physics and Engineering Systems at MIT, where he was a member of the faculty since 1973. While at MIT, he headed the Department of Physics and the Bates Linear Accelerator Center, a nuclear science lab funded by the U.S. Department of Energy. He also served as the founding director of the MIT Energy Initiative and as director of the MIT Laboratory for Energy and the Environment. Secretary Moniz was also a terrific and generous colleague. When I was at MIT, and I was there for 30 years of my life, it was then Professor Moniz who showed me how powerful the combination of technical and rigorous policy analysis could be for addressing some of the world's problems. And this, what he showed me then, is something that I carry with me still today, and I try to infuse in the kind of interactions that I have here at Brown. It came as no surprise to his colleagues at MIT when he was called upon to apply his exceptional knowledge and expertise to further the nation's interests through government service. First serving as the Associate Director for Science in the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the Executive Office of the President, then as Under-Secretary of the Department of Energy from 1997 to 2001 in the Clinton administration. And in this role, he was responsible for overseeing the department's science and energy programs, leading a comprehensive review of nuclear weapons stockpile stewardship and serving as the Secretary's special negotiator for the disposition of Russian nuclear materials. Dr. Moniz was appointed U.S. Secretary of Energy in May 2013, and it is noteworthy, given the tone and tenor of congressional affairs today, that Secretary Moniz was confirmed by the U.S. Senate by a vote of 97-0. For the last 3 years, he has been actively pursuing an expansive agenda that includes advancing President Obama's energy strategy, maintaining the nuclear deterrent, and reducing the global nuclear threat, and promoting American leadership in science and clean energy technology innovation. He has been working on these last items during his campus visit today. Secretary Moniz began his day here at Brown's Math Institute, ICERM, joining with Senator Sheldon Whitehouse and other federal, state, and local business and higher education leaders to discuss opportunities to strengthen our regional approach to clean energy. And over lunch at the Watson Institute, he met with Brown students and faculty who are conducting Department of Energy funded research aimed at expanding our clean energy technology knowledge and progress. Clearly, the Department of Energy has a critical role to play in growing the economy, protecting the environment, and enhancing national security. This has become increasingly evident under the leadership of Secretary Moniz. It is not just his signature silver mane that has caught the nation's attention. It is that rare combination of deep and impeccable technical knowledge and supreme diplomatic skills that were on display throughout the course of the negotiations towards the comprehensive nuclear deal with Iran. Dr. Moniz served as a key negotiator alongside Secretary of State John Kerry. In this role, he negotiated the technical details with the Iranian Atomic Energy Minister Ali Akbar Salehi, an MIT graduate. He also offered important reassurances to political leaders in the signatory countries that this deal would further our strategic interests. It's because of that combination of technical knowledge and diplomatic skills that he was able to play this second very, very important role, which led to a comprehensive agreement that was finalized on July 14, 2015. For this and for his work on clean energy and innovation, Secretary Moniz has earned a reputation for being a smart, direct, and highly effective leader, not something we hear often enough with respect to our national policymakers. In fact, a recent Washington Post column by David Ignatius refers to Secretary Moniz as, quote, arguably President Obama's best cabinet appointment, and went on to underscore the success he has had leading what he said, he quoted again, a quiet revolution in clean energy technology. The piece concludes noting the importance of having world-class scientists such as Moniz overseeing the intersection of government and technology. And I can't agree more. And I hope that many of the scientists, both social scientists and physical natural scientists in this room today, are inspired to pursue a similar path. Please join me in welcoming U.S. Secretary of Energy, Ernest Moniz.
Well, thank you, Rick, for that very generous introduction. In the remaining few minutes, I do appreciate being here today at Brown. As Rick said, it's been a great day covering a lot of the issues at DOE, from nuclear security to science and of course, clean energy and the climate challenge. I also appreciate being here for this Ogden lecture, and I'll return to that at the end. But I think I've seen the list of the extremely distinguished speakers that this series has had for half a century, and I appreciate being added to that list. Also, it's great seeing Rick again. Rick and I were, as he mentioned, at MIT for a long time. We not only talking about his issues of global supply chain, sustainability, et cetera. He and my wife carried on discussions about Brazil, and Rick and I had a lot of discussions about how addressing the energy issue really required reaching across all the disciplines, and I think we successfully managed to bring in 4 schools very, very actively in the program. And Rick says there's some progress in this direction here as well, and he certainly is a very good leader for that. I might say that I also saw, probably here somewhere, is Ed Steinfeld, another. I've met 2 other of the people that Locke has taken from MIT. I don't know. In fact, most of the ones who, outside of science and engineering, who were really working hard in our energy initiative. But it's really great, and I really appreciate seeing them again. But being here at Brown, as Rick mentioned, I don't live. I grew up not very far away, and in fact, today in seeing some of the interesting innovation going on the campus. One that particularly struck me was the hydrofoil, a recipient of one of our ARPA-E awards, but most importantly, being tested in the Taunton River, a quarter mile from where I grew up and where I used to fish. So I'm very reassured by the fact that this will not harm the fish in the Taunton River. As already mentioned, look, today's invitation, I think, clearly was stimulated by the Iran negotiations, and I will return to that at some level of detail. But I do want to reemphasize, we've already said it, but I want to reemphasize that the Department of Energy is engaged really in two, what I would call clearly international issues of overarching importance, not just for this country, but for really all the countries of the world. One is nuclear security, where there are many things to be concerned about, including some of the activities surrounding, for example, the recent tragic events in Belgium and the apparent interest in nuclear issues by that group. And secondly, climate and clean energy. We're going to focus in these remarks on nuclear security. But I just want to make a pitch that in the process leading to Paris, innovation was, in my view, finally placed squarely on the front burner as a critical element of being able to address our climate challenges. And on the road from Paris, it will be one of the essential underpinnings of the increasing ambition the countries of the world will muster over the next decades to go to a very deep decarbonization to achieve our goals. So I think innovation that keeps driving down the costs of clean energy. We've had great success in many technologies over the last years. We'll need more success in those and more technologies over the next decade. So that's another lecture. I don't know what name you have for that lecture, Rick, but we can come back and do that. But let's turn to nuclear security. As already stated, the department has very broad responsibilities in this area. The nuclear deterrent, where we have succeeded now for more than 20 years in both shrinking the deterrent and avoiding any need for nuclear tests. Again, another long story, another lecture would be on the future of things like the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. We have responsibilities for nonproliferation, and specifically in the securing and, when possible, eliminating nuclear materials of risk of nuclear explosions, but also risk of the so-called dirty bomb phenomenon, radiological sources, and the like. We have responsibilities tied to the last point to avoid nuclear terrorism. That involves programs such as strong global programs on things like nuclear smuggling, training multinational groups in terms of nuclear security. Perhaps less well known than those, although some of those were not well known to many, but we also have responsibility for our nuclear Navy propulsion. And in fact, we just had our new next generation aircraft carrier reactor go critical. Of course, we also have a big nuclear energy program. That is not nuclear security per se. However, when one gets to fuel cycle issues of enrichment and reprocessing, these have very strong intersections with nuclear security. In fact, 2/3 of our budget is in the nuclear realm, one way or the other. Those fuel cycle issues clearly were at the heart of the risk that the world community perceived in Iran and led to those negotiations. It's been, frankly, terrific to be Secretary of Energy at a time when there's a president who put both of those major issues on his front burner, nuclear security and climate change. On nuclear security, as a reminder, President Obama, in April of 2009, so shortly after he took office, laid out a comprehensive agenda in Prague for addressing this whole set of nuclear security issues. He then followed up with a set of nuclear security summits. The last one just held in March in D.C. Pretty remarkable when you have approximately 40 heads of state coming for a summit on nuclear security issues. This was the fourth in line, but I do want to also emphasize that we will run through the tape in January of 2017 in terms of addressing these issues. In his Prague speech, the president said, "The threat of nuclear war has gone down, but the risk of a nuclear attack has gone up." And that was largely referring, of course, to the risk of increased terrorism and possibly organized crime throughout the world. So I'll just say a few words about my own background in this and then turn to the specific agenda at hand. I just note that my own engagement in nuclear security goes back to 1978 in working on an American Physical Society report on nuclear fuel cycles, and I took a lead on the nonproliferation agenda, and at least for my former MIT colleagues, they may remember Hermann Feshbach, the gentle head of physics who basically said, "So what if you're a junior faculty? Get out there and do something for society." He made me do it, and I'm very, very grateful he did. But that's also a message, I think, for a lot of young people in terms of just having the courage to go out and do some different things that can have major consequences. Who knows? You might become Secretary of Energy in 45 years and find it's quite useful. But then in the Clinton administration, I want to emphasize that Rick mentioned that I was called the special negotiator with Russia for these nuclear materials issues, and led 3 negotiations at that time. One on putting the famous megatons to megawatts deal back on track. If you don't know what that is, you can ask a question. Secondly, negotiating the pathways for plutonium disposition, something that is regrettably not yet resolved. I might mention the megatons to megawatts project finished a 20-year successful lifetime, fell off the rails a couple of times, but just so you know the scale, 500 tons of Russian weapons material was blended down to nuclear reactor fuel for U.S. reactors, supplying approximately 10% of all U.S. electricity for 20 years. I mean, it's a big deal, right? The third was a failed negotiation on the nuclear fuel cycle, but maybe that sets up the success, perhaps, in terms of the Iran deal, which we will come to. But in addition to that, and this again, something I'll come back to at the end, particularly for the students, is these negotiations, tend to be points where everybody pays attention. But in that same time period, we had responsibility for doing things like scientist-to-scientist interactions with Russia, weapons scientist to weapons scientist interactions with Russia, supporting science, a non-proliferation initiative, because frankly, it was part of keeping them home in a time of economic turmoil. So what I want to emphasize is what I would call real diplomacy is not just negotiating a piece of paper. It's also the ongoing work to maintain international relations in a positive way that can then lead to often surprising outcomes. Let me say a few words about the Nuclear Security Summit that just ended. As I mentioned, about 40 leaders, 50 countries overall. The span of these, starting in 2010, stimulated by the Prague speech, has been pretty remarkable. All high-enriched uranium and plutonium is gone from South America. Central Europe and Southeast Asia are on track to accomplish that very soon. Switzerland sent its last plutonium out of the country. And by the way, these all sound simple. I can assure you, you don't just call up UPS and ask them to move this. A lot of technology goes into these, often with international collaboration. During this summit process, 14 countries and Taiwan removed all HEU. Japan announced that they are sending very significant, hundreds of nuclear weapons worth of HEU and plutonium back to the United States for disposal. We have formed regional partnerships in many parts of the world. Just a month and a half or so ago, I was in China to dedicate a joint project on a Center of Excellence for Nuclear Security. 2,000 people will be trained every year in there to address nuclear security issues, and not just from China, but China and the entire region. So these are the kinds of things that have come from this summit, and there's an issue of carrying this on. And so what the president did was work with our partners to establish what's called a Nuclear Security Contact Group. 39 countries, Interpol, UN organizations, all working together to extend this work on controlling nuclear materials. Having said all that, we have a legitimate glass half full, glass half empty situation, because the work isn't done until we get the remainder of these materials under control, and there remain quite a bit out there across the world, but that's why it's going to be so important to continue this work. So that gives you a little bit of the backdrop of what we've been doing in nuclear security broadly, but let me turn to the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, that I know many of you want to hear, I guess, a little bit more about. I might say, once again, the day here at Brown has been terrific, especially learning about the class that just did a scenario on a violation of the JCPOA, and as I understand, it was all resolved fine at the UN Security Council. But I think I've given some of the undergraduates some additional homework by asking for a synthetic report that summarizes this scenario-based approach, which I think is a great way to teach, and it also explains why some of the Brown student newspaper interviewers knew so much in detail about what was going on with this deal. The Iran deal clearly represented a very unusual intersection of science and diplomacy. Obviously, science influencing diplomacy is nothing new. And I might say, I want to make it very clear, that my personal engagement in the Iran negotiations, starting just over a year ago in February, should not hide the fact that our laboratories, our sites, our nuclear expertise in those institutions was part of the negotiation all the time. After all, who else is going to supply the detailed, specific, in-depth technical analysis to support negotiating positions? What was unusual was, in some sense, science getting moved to the front table in the negotiation, as Rick mentioned, in parallel with John Kerry on our side and with counterparts on the Iranian side. Now, the situation was that actually European countries, sometimes called the E3, had started negotiations many years ago. The P5+1 was engaged in negotiations with Iran for many years, over a decade. There was also, of course, in place a very effective, in the last years, I don't mean over a decade, but in the last years, a very effective economic sanctions regime on Iran, which was possible only because so many countries of the world cooperated together. This was not a case of unilateral sanctions. This was a case of multilateral sanctions, well beyond the P5+1, really impacting Iran's economy in a significant way. The other ground truth was that in that situation, Iran had an incredibly rapidly expanding nuclear program. They were up to nearly 20,000 centrifuges. They were well along in building a reactor that would have substantial plutonium production on the scale of, let's say, more than a weapon's worth per year, and a whole variety of other activities in terms of R&D on more advanced centrifuges and the like. Later, perhaps when we discuss the deal, we should always remember that you have to compare to what it would otherwise be like. And I'll come back to that, and it would not be a pretty picture. So that was the situation. The understanding of what a deal would look like in the most general terms was fairly obvious. There would be some sort of rollback of the Iranian nuclear program in return for sanctions relief. But saying that is a long way from having an agreement, and in fact, there was very little progress being made. A fundamental issue is, which I think was recognized in Iran in particular, was that it's very hard to have a major rollback of a program built up over many, many years in a country without having, in this case, Dr. Ali Akbar Salehi essentially at the table. He was the head of the Atomic Energy Organization. He was a previous president of Sharif University. He's a vice president. He's a former foreign minister, is a person of considerable talent and influence. And basically, early last year, it became clear that if one was going to break the logjam, he had to come to the table, and I was the counterpart to negotiate with him. So it became an interesting negotiation with Secretary Kerry, Minister of Foreign Affairs Zarif, kind of focusing on the political, economic aspects, Salehi and I focusing on the nuclear aspects, and of course, staying in touch in terms of how these would go along. Much has been made of the fact that Salehi, as the provost mentioned, as an MIT PhD, 1977. I was there. I was at MIT. We did not know each other. I might observe. Prime Minister Netanyahu was also at MIT at the same time. None of us knew each other. And I met with him last week, 2 weeks ago. But the MIT connection certainly helped to establish a relationship, which I would say became a real relationship of trust. Not that we were compromising in any way our objectives, but we understood that we could talk to each other in ways that we had trust in commitments being sustained, and that was important. Certainly, Salehi's thesis advisor, Mike Driscoll, those my MIT colleagues may know him, a very good friend of mine, and that certainly we had many connections. But you know, in the end, I think that was a real plus. But what really helped was, I think, frankly, we got into a negotiation where we both had, whatever this means, scientists' worldviews. And that led to, I think, a very different negotiating style, frankly, than was typical. Whatever the case, we got there in the end. So another very important part is that, on our side at least, we had the very active and clear guidance of the President, so that we understood what our key objectives were and understood that we had flexibility to achieve those objectives as long as we met them. That proved to be very crucial. So basically, I would say that we very rapidly, Salehi and I basically, could very rapidly find out, understand what each other's absolute core objectives were. For us, the President made it clear that we would have to have a one-year breakout time. Breakout time here is being defined a little bit unconventionally. What it means is the time that it would take to reach enough nuclear material for a first explosive in a sprint. So the conditions had to be such that a sprint would not get you even to the material in 1 year for some extended period to be defined. And in addition, that there would have to be a very strong verification regime that would have some strong elements going on, roughly speaking, forever. So those were the two things on our side that we absolutely had to have. On the Iranian side, my interpretation would be that they would need to have some level of activity going on in all the elements of their program, obviously, possibly greatly reduced, but some level of activity, and not give up the prerogatives of a peaceful nuclear program at some point down the road. Those were two dates that were open. As you can imagine, there were quite some differences about what those dates would be. But if you take that set of conditions, it's pretty easy to see they are not mutually exclusive. They leave room for a solution. Not easily reached, perhaps, but a solution. So that's what the negotiation, our negotiation at least, was about. How do you define a nuclear program meeting all of those conditions? What's come out is, first of all, very clearly, a basic structure of significant constraints on the Iranian program for 15 years, plus the kind of strong verification, I'll describe that in a second, that I mentioned, and some additional features that again I will come back to. And of course, the nuclear sanctions are rolled back. I do want to emphasize that not all the sanctions on Iran have been rolled back, because they are the subject of multiple sanctions, unilaterally, multilaterally, and UN Security Council. There were sanctions for the nuclear program, but also sanctions for missile activities, for supporting terrorists, for human rights, a whole set of sanctions that have not been lifted. But otherwise, I will focus now on the nuclear side. So let me tell you some, not all, but some of the core elements that have come out of this. So on the plutonium side, it was only a few years ago that the plutonium risks were viewed as the highest risk. And there was the talk about bombing the reactor, et cetera, et cetera. But where we are today is that reactor core has had cement poured into it. Beats the alternative. But the P5+1 has committed to working to help redesign a new reactor that will have comparable, equal performance, but produce an order of magnitude less plutonium. Which is frankly good enough in a certain sense, but supplemented by a commitment on their part to send the spent fuel from that reactor out of the country for its lifetime. That's where the plutonium resides. And furthermore, to have a limit on their heavy water inventories. On uranium, They have retained about 1/3 of their centrifuges operating. However, only the most elementary one, the IR1. However, on top of that, this is where some might be surprised about they're still spinning 5,000 centrifuges enriching. However, they are constrained to having no more than 300 kilograms of very low enriched uranium at any time. By the way, they started out with over 10 tons, and including a certain amount of 20% enriched uranium. But anyway, I don't want to get into too much detail. But so all that uranium has gone to Russia for it's like a sale, getting back natural uranium as opposed to enriched uranium. But it's the combination of the centrifuges, the 300 kilograms, and limitations on the R&D program that together achieve that year breakout time that I talk about. So those were the kinds of trade-offs that we had the flexibility to do within the core objectives. And having done so, Iran retains a capability in each of the areas, but with 15 years of strong constraints. Verification. There are other things, again, but I won't go through all of it. Verification, critical. For one thing, there is a procurement channel so that any kind of dual-use items, anything on the nuclear suppliers group list basically, has to go through a procurement channel to make sure that it is going to an appropriate end use. Very importantly, however, the additional protocol. The additional protocol is the basis of the IAEA inspectors' ability to access suspicious sites, that is, sites that have not been declared to be nuclear sites. However, the loophole right now is that the additional protocol, and Iran has agreed to the additional protocol, quotes, forever. But the loophole right now is that the additional protocol does not provide a time limit within which the IAEA must be granted access. And there have been examples of years of clarifying questions, shall we say. This is the first time there is a fixed time limit that is meaningful, 14 plus 10 days, basically, time limit as the maximum time for access. There are other things that are firsts. For 20 years, the IAEA will have direct surveillance of manufacturing of centrifuge components. For 25 years, the IAEA will have surveillance over the uranium supply chain. This is unprecedented. The IAEA would have liked to have had uranium supply chain surveillance in other contexts. They have it here. Jim Clapper, the Director of National Intelligence in the United States, said, upon seeing these things, that, look, no one sensible will ever say there is a 100% probability of catching anything done outside the agreement. But the bar for getting caught has been raised incredibly high, and certainly as a major deterrent, and we feel very confident, certainly, of our capabilities of catching just about anything. 29 distinguished scientists, one of them may be here in the audience, Leon Cooper, I don't know if Leon is here, from Brown, signed a letter to the president when these conditions were put forward, which we appreciated very much, saying that this was the most stringent non-proliferation agreement ever negotiated, and that indeed it would be wonderful if a lot of these provisions could be extended to be part of the general nonproliferation regime. That will not be easy, but it is a very worthwhile adventure to take on. It may be that some of the undergraduates will have to take it on in a couple decades, but it is something really to push hard on. So that's in many ways the core, but I'll mention one more thing, again, which was part of that scientist letter. All the countries that are signatories to the Non-Proliferation Treaty agree that they will not pursue nuclear weapons. And Iran has reiterated that specifically in this agreement. But what no other country has done until now, Iran has done, with no time limit, is to forego research and development on some specific weaponization activities. I mean, again, without getting into great detail, things like explosively driven neutron sources, which has a particular application. So this is another major step. Now, it depends upon verification, obviously, but another major step. So we think this is this agreement was to address the nuclear weapon issue, the existential issue of a nuclear weapon. We feel extremely confident in its provisions. I might say, actually, Rick mentioned July 14 juillet was the day for the agreement. Implementation day, meaning Iran satisfied all those conditions on January 16th. I mean, 6 months. Really, frankly, they beat my expectations in terms of getting there. And now we are 3 months into implementation. So far, so good, and hopefully that will continue. But the debate goes on. I want to just make a few closing points. First of all, the critiques that one hears about the JCPOA, I'd like you to think about. They are mostly critiques not of the agreement, but of what the agreement is not. It is not an agreement on ballistic missiles or Hezbollah or Houthis. Those are all areas of great concern to us. But this agreement was about a verifiable agreement to take the nuclear weapon issue off the table, and then to deal with the other issues, perhaps even doubling down on those other issues. And in fact, the administration has been very active in terms of working with the Gulf countries, our Gulf allies, and with Israel in terms of turning up the heat on these other activities. We know there's a complex set of activities with, again, Hezbollah and Hamas and Syria, Iraq, Yemen, etc. So the only critique that I would say pertains to the agreement per se is the one that, well, 15 years, by the way, plus verification. Why not longer? Well, that's called a negotiation, right? And again, this is where I would go back to the point. What would 15 years from now look like without the agreement? Iran would have a struggling economy. If sanctions could hold together for so long, they would probably have, I don't know, 100,000 centrifuges. I don't know how many tens of tons of material, 20% material, et cetera, et cetera. They would have a reactor producing a lot of plutonium every year. It's a little bit hard to understand why that's a better picture than the one we have, or certainly taking the kinds of actions needed to prevent that picture from being more attractive than where we are today. So that's one point. Oh, and by the way, I should have said, however many centrifuges, whatever, and of course, without any verification. So basically complete free reign Finally, we hear a lot about U.S. unilateral withdrawal in 2017. I won't suggest what circumstances might lead to that. Well, this is an excellent worst of both worlds option. As I said earlier, the P5+1 plus the EU, I think I said it earlier. If I didn't, I'm saying it now. We're remarkably coherent throughout this negotiation. I remind you, the US and Russia are not exactly on the best of terms at the moment. And yet on this issue, there was complete commitment to the same objective. As I did say, the international coherence was absolutely critical for the effectiveness of the sanctions. As Brent Scowcroft said, Republican National Security Advisor, we walk away alone. That's the reality. The prospects of a coherent sanctions regime being reinforced without the same kind of coherence, which would be called for only if Iran violates the agreement, simply, it stretches the imagination to believe that that would somehow magically be there. So I feel good sense will prevail, and the issue will be to maintain our vigilance, sustain our effort. By the way, it will not be easy. When I said things like, we succeeded to get a 25-year surveillance of the uranium supply chain, I remind you, the 25 years, that means we have to do it. We, it was the IAEA, but we have to do it. We have to supply the resources. We have to maintain the attention on this. So it's not going to be, easy on our side either. But we have to sustain this. And of course, we all hope. The deal stands on its own. It's about nuclear weapons. It's about verification. But obviously, we all hope that over some period of time, there will be a change in the overall regional engagement of Iran, and we'll see what happens. But make no mistake about it, it's a deal about nuclear weapons and verification. Nuclear security is going to remain an issue. We'd all like it to go away, but it's not going away. It's going to be an important issue. It will certainly go past my generation in terms of an important issue. It's one in which we have to sustain a focus, sustain a discussion, and frankly, invest the resources to prevent the worst outcome we could imagine in terms of nuclear materials, nuclear explosives, particularly in the hands of terrorists. In closing, again, I want to go back to this lecture being dedicated to the memory of Steve Ogden and his dedication to international peace and security. And it's encouraging to see here the incredible interest among so many students that we met today, which is really great. I want to just end by saying something I alluded to earlier, especially for the students. Diplomacy, is generally thought of as, the negotiation of agreements between states. And that's incredibly important. That's what this JCPOA was. A number of states, P5+1, EU, Iran. But again, I want to reemphasize the other definition of diplomacy is the promotion of good relationships between countries, which is often the precondition for getting the first thing done, an agreement. In this case, it was not based upon good relations, but if I go back to Russia in the 1990s, all of those scientist-to-scientist collaborations were important. And the message is, diplomacy is not only done by diplomats, it's done by all of those who are working to sustain these good relationships. All disciplines take part. I was pleased to be part of a science diplomacy initiative, but we need everybody pitching in. on these important problems. Thank you.
We have time for questions and comments, and what I would like to do is invite students to first ask the questions, and if we have time, turn to other members of our community. And when you ask a question, two things. One is if you can identify yourself, and secondly, make sure that it is a question and relatively brief. And why don't we start? How about here on the right?
Hi, my name is Michelle Shai. I'm a sophomore studying international relations here at Brown. So my question is, specifically, you spoke of your meetings 2 weeks ago with Netanyahu, and obviously there were rifts in the relationship between the United States and Israel over the JCPOA, and which was explicitly evident last summer. And what is the relationship with Israel, specifically in terms of nuclear policies, and what you mentioned as, quote, turning up the heat on other activities, look like presently from your privileged perspective as the head of the Department of Energy?
Well, first of all, I have to say I had a very, very warm reception and an excellent couple of days in Israel. I was hosted by Minister Steinitz, who is my corresponding minister. I'd say that the Prime Minister and the Minister and others that I met in the government, first of all, they are all pursuing what they have said publicly, namely that during the negotiation, it was very clear they were not supporting it. It's done, and now it's about verification and working together. And that is the way we are working on this. And we've had many Vice President, Secretary of Defense. By the way, the President will be in Saudi Arabia. So we are working with our friends in the region. Israel in particular, that's the way the nuclear issue is being addressed. But I must say, we had issues on clean energy. We had clean energy discussions. Prime Minister and the Minister, obviously, the Prime Minister as well, very interested in that. They of course, are world leaders in water technologies, and we made an announcement about some enhanced work there. We announced an expanded postdoctoral exchange on clean energy, and we talked about the development of their natural gas reserve. So very, very broad-ranging, and as you know, very, 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 very collegial.
Great, thanks. How about over here?
Hi. Firstly, thank you so much for coming to speak at Brown. It's an incredible opportunity to listen to you. My name is Evan. I am a first-year student, probably studying environmental science. And my question is a little bit about the geopolitical context behind this idea of nuclear safety and security. So my question is, why do you think it is that Iran is sanctioned and persecuted for proliferating weapons, with sanctions that have completely damaged its economy and frankly hurt its populations and its people, when Israel is a state that has a history of bombing people and innocent people in the Gaza Strip, is not sanctioned for producing the same weapons that Iran is. It is not sanctioned for hurting people, and is not sanctioned, for like creating a climate that you say you hope to kind of navigate through.
Look, the Iranian situation in 2003, it was very clear the international community came together and found Iran's activities towards nuclear weapons to be, shall we say, suspicious. The IAEA has produced its report, which reaffirms that. And everyone viewed that as an extremely destabilizing situation for the entire region, which is why, again, the international community displayed such coherence in the negotiations and in the sanctions regime. Again, we're all hoping that Iran will be much more integrated into the community of nations in these next years.
Great, thanks. Over here.
Hi, I'm Joe, a freshman studying computer science. And I'm just wondering what you see the future of the deal as in maybe 15, 20, or 25 years as the provisions begin to expire. Do you want to renew the provisions? I mean, like, do you see your successors renewing the provisions or like expanding them or making them less strict? Yeah.
Well, no, my expectation is that there is this agreement, and I have optimism that it will be executed as laid out. After 15 years, Iran will have all of its prerogatives to develop a peaceful program, but again, verification. We have a strong verification regime that will continue beyond that. There is a mechanism in the agreement for Iran or the P5+1 to put forward proposed modifications, expansions, interpretations, but essentially, it requires going through this process that has been put in place. But I expect, certainly for many years at least, it's going to be a question of seeing compliance on all sides, I might add, with the agreement.
Thank you.
Great. Yes.
Hi, I'm Evan. I study physics. You mentioned isolated neutron sources, and to my knowledge, the only really proper use for that is in detonating an atomic bomb. So in these negotiations, I don't mean to imply that maybe the Iranian diplomats were trying to trick you, but was there any point in which you needed to use your scientific nose and say, okay, wait, something's not right, or the truth wasn't being fully disclosed?
Well, first of all, let me say I don't want to personalize this too much. I was the lead negotiator for the nuclear dimensions, but again, this was always with a very large national laboratory system at our back. In fact, it came out in the newspapers. We had not advertised it, but it came out that there were 7 DOE national laboratories and 2 additional nuclear sites that were engaged in all the dimensions of this agreement, and there were many dimensions. And I might add that with the negotiations taking part in Switzerland or Vienna, the 9-hour time difference to California really helped keep those Livermore people up at night, producing analyses for our morning. So it was quite convenient. So technical, rather deep technical knowledge played a role throughout. There were many trade-offs that we need to stay within our core objective, and those were done. Again, many analyses. I would say that, having, my own background certainly helped in terms of being able to frame the questions that I needed to have answered, specifically in the context of what Dr. Salehi was talking about, was proposing, et cetera. So to me, it really is it was a interesting case of the intersection of science and diplomacy, whether that carries over to other arenas, maybe even including climate change, remains to be seen.
Thank you. Great.
Thank you again so much for joining us today. My name is Jason. I'm a senior studying political science. You spoke a lot, obviously, about the Iran deal and also about the future prospects for a broader nuclear non-proliferation treaty. But you also alluded a lot to terrorist groups, non-state actors that today still continue to pose a threat of a dirty bomb or smuggling situation of that nature. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the challenges that we face with those groups that wouldn't necessarily feel the same incentive to comply to an international treaty.
Well, yeah, I think it almost speaks for itself, frankly, that that particularly the brand of terrorism with international reach that we see today certainly does not suggest any holding back if they had the capability with nuclear materials. So basically prevention is absolutely essential here. Again, I would say that we've made a lot of progress in locking up nuclear weapons usable materials. Clearly, we've started but have a long way to go on radiological sources because of their relative ubiquity in the economy. Among other things, so we need to work on security. We need to keep working on security, keep working on training, work on emergency response. But we also need to keep working on the technologies that might replace those sources for medical use or for well logging and the like, because certainly it is possible to replace those sources. But that's a longer term prospect.
That's great. Yes.
Hi, I'm Warren Smith. I'm from Dallas. I'm a junior studying geophysics. So with the expiration of the megatons to megawatts program, has the United States created a dependence on Russian nuclear fuel? And is international collaboration or national independence and security more important for the U.S. in developing a effective and peaceful nuclear program?
I'm sorry, I missed the second question. Could you repeat that?
Yeah, is international collaboration or national independence and security more important when the U.S. is trying to develop a peaceful and effective nuclear program?
Okay. Well, you know, I think I think there's no way that one is going to just kind of, you know, close one's eyes to what's happening internationally. That would be a big mistake. In fact, it is the fact that we have had historically a major nuclear energy program with enrichment, which we don't have anymore, with fuel fabrication, with reactors, reactor design and construction, et cetera, that has always been a major part of our non-proliferation posture. Indeed, the United States, we feel we have the gold standard in terms of the kinds of conditions we put on the use of nuclear technologies and materials that are U.S. origin. So that remains very important. There was a concern, sorry, Rick, I was going to say it, but there is a concern that our position in the international nuclear energy sphere is not what it was a while ago. And a lot more players coming in, and we do have concerns. We will have to continue to work through multilateral organizations, but we have concerns about how that non-proliferation regime will be sustained as there are more and more vendors, if you like, in that space.
I think we have time for 2 more questions.
Thank you again for your lecture. I was curious as to what your personal goals are for the future and what you would like to accomplish with the rest of your career.
Come to Brown.
Right now, my career has a 9-month horizon, and we can talk again on January 21st. So look, at DOE, we have a lot of work to do. First of all, on what we talked about today, the Iran program is one where implementation is not, it's not like, okay, now it's implementation and we're finished. So we still have substantial activity, working with the IAEA, et cetera. And that applies to a bigger non-proliferation agenda for this year. But turning to the climate side, clean energy side, we really want to do all that we can to really give a good push towards what we call mission innovation, this substantial increase in funding for energy R&D, United States and internationally. We want to work to connect more strongly what we do, what we support, whether it's in our labs or in universities or in small companies, connect that to the investment world, because we need to accelerate the development and deployment of those technologies at scale. That's what we need for the decarbonization. That's going to be a big focus. A third area is to continue, this is now getting more inside baseball, so I won't go into great detail, but we have been strengthening the strategic relationship as to how the department uses the national laboratories to plan the science agendas going forward. And frankly, again, this is not what this audience wants to hear, but to try to institutionalize some of the major organizational changes that we have made. And one of them, I'll just mention one of them, which I think has been recognized as a big step forward, is we have combined our science and energy programs under one undersecretary to get much more synergy between them, and I think that's paying off.
Great. Thank you so much.
And this is the last question.
Philip Simeski, Junior Mechanical Engineering Concentrator here at Brown. First, I would like to applaud on the ARPA-E efforts for increasing R&D and innovation funding for all the clean energy technology. So building on that, I would ask you a twofold question. Do you think that all clean energy technologies should get a fair chance, or should we prefer solar or wind or ocean or hydro? And building on that, and what you said about the way we use the national labs, are there ways the Department of Energy can influence and open up more local and state level support opportunities for clean technology ventures?
Well, in the first question, we've been very clear that we support an all-of-the-above approach. And all of the above means efficiency, nuclear, renewables, and fossil energy technologies with low emissions. So make no bones about it that we start with the low carbon requirement. But then and by the way, there's more than that. There's also infrastructure, grids, smart grids, et cetera, storage, you know. But our view, my view certainly, is that the low carbon solutions will look very different in different countries, and they will look very different even in different parts of our country. And our job is not to choose the marketplace solutions. Our job is to do the R&D to enable marketplace competition. Some may not make it, some may. I mean, in fossil fuels, a clear example is carbon capture and sequestration, or carbon capture, as somebody wanted to emphasize today, and I agree, carbon capture utilization and sequestration. So we are working across the board on all of these. All we want to make sure is the marketplace has as many options as it can to meet greater ambition in low carbon. In terms of the second question, in fact, today we had quite a discussion about one thing that we have proposed this year is to establish regional innovation partnerships. We would like to see some increase in funding, and to have some of that increase literally be managed, not by us, but by regional nonprofit organizations that can take advantage of regional capabilities, regional opportunities, regional needs, and basically guide that portfolio development towards a clean energy future. We also think that that kind of a structure would probably naturally also get more state support, involvement, including in weaving that into an enhanced, what's sometimes called innovation ecosystem, because we need more of that around the country. So we are all for these regional innovation partnerships. In fact, today, was fundamentally the first of a set of regional meetings we are having to discuss regional partnerships. Next week will be Kentucky, in case you want to come down.
Thank you.
So, Secretary Moniz, it's been wonderful to have you here at Brown. I think I heard at least 2 or 3 future lectures that you've committed to give here, and whatever happens in the fall and in January, please know that you're always welcome to be here at Brown University. It's a great honor to have you. Please join me in thanking Secretary Moniz.